Yay! We are live. So we just have a couple of minutes. We're gonna wait in case people want to join. So there was a huge interest in the topic. So there were lots of people clicking interested and coming. So we'll give a few minutes and then we'll start a talk. And Rachel is here. So thank you
Hi,
for
guys.
coming. And she is coming to Facebook Live from New York, and I am from Ohio. And I will say a few words about Rachel in just a few. Hi, Debbie. Yay. Yeah, now we know how the comments work. Thank you for saying you're here because we're trying to learn technology here too. How's things in Ohio on the other side, Debbie? She's from Ohio too. All right. Or maybe she's in Mexico. Because they used to travel to Mexico. Hi, Grace. Hello, hello. All right. Yeah, at least people who said they're coming, they're here. Yay. Awesome. All right. So, yeah, let's see if anybody else wants to say hi. And since you're guys there, you're welcome to write your questions in your comments, and I'm going to be watching for the questions. So if you know anything you would like us to touch upon, please do. All right, and that's 3 o'clock, so we're going to be precise. And if anybody else is joining later, please say hi. And again, welcome to write your questions. So I'm going to read a few things about Rachel. So Rachel Parrotta, is it how you say it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That sounds good.
So she's a doctor of physical therapy, and she received her degree in 2008. So like I said before, she's coming to us from New York, New York.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And where are you originally from?
So I'm from here, from Long Island, New York.
Okay, very nice. So for the last 12 years, Rachel has specialized her practice in the treatment of pelvic health conditions. And she's been working with both genders, men and women, which is exciting because I know when I work with men, they always say I don't have pelvic floor.
Mm-hmm.
Debunked. Okay. So Rachel believes that the role of physical therapist is to empower clients with the most effective tools and information in order to help clients reach their goals. And I love this about Rachel. Rachel strongly believes that the power of healing lies in the hands of the client rather than in the hands of the practitioner. And that is the truth. We're just the guides and educators sometimes. So Rachel has 2 boys, and that's what really inspired her to devote her practice into understanding pelvic floor and helping also other women. She's particularly working with women who had babies, but really of all ages. So, and of course, I work with women 40 plus, and we're going to try to kind of gear our information to the audience of women 40 plus. We're going to talk about some core myths and pelvic floor. So, Rachel, do you want to add anything else about you that might be interesting and I didn't mention?
Sure, and I think you did a great job. I started my career actually in sports medicine a little bit. So my career has been, I worked a lot with male athletes, which seems pretty disconnected to where I am now. But like you said, men have pelvic floors too. And as we'll discuss, the pelvic floor is left out of a lot of conversations, even in sports and strength and conditioning. And we're hoping to do a better job of bridging that gap and including the pelvic floor in these conversations, so that we're not as surprised when things pop up and people have symptoms.
Exactly. Yes. And we need that. We need that gap to be filled with good information and also the tools so that we can treat our body as a whole thing. And the pelvic floor is the base of that thing. So it's kind of like doing a lot of things for us as we are designed to be vertical against gravity. But before we go into some myths and all that other hot discussion, let's maybe try to define what is core, that we are going to be using it in this kind of topic, And then maybe it's going to be good to define what is pelvic floor and why we're kind of trying to use them both in one sentence. So if you give us sort of a brief version of it.
Sure. So I think in the past we talked about core being just the abdominal wall. And now we're trying to discuss core being including the diaphragm, the abdominal wall, the pelvic floor. Sometimes we talk about the stabilizing muscles in the low back. Some people go up to even the throat. But we're talking more oftentimes about, there's different ways to talk about it. But some people say core canister or core container. So we're talking about from diaphragm down to pelvic floor and the surrounding area instead of just thinking about the abdominal wall. And why we are thinking about all those as a whole is what we find as pelvic floor therapists is a lot of times what's happening at the pelvic floor is being heavily influenced by what's happening above in the diaphragm and in the abdominals. And when we're seeing issues of the pelvic floor, like leaking urine with exercise, sometimes the pelvic floor itself is in okay shape, but it's how someone's using their breath, their diaphragm, and their abdominal wall that's impacting the pelvic floor at the bottom. So I can show a little diagram. You want a little diagram?
Yes, she came prepared.
So people are surprised that there's
higher up.
Oh,
yeah, there's a sign here. So yeah, perfect.
People are surprised that there's muscles in the pelvis, that like intravaginally or intrarectally, that there's muscle there, because we're not often taught that. So there's 3 layers of muscle. There's muscle. This is a female pelvis. Someone that identifies as female has a vaginal opening, and there's deeper layer of muscle. So there's a lot of muscles, and I just like to show that so people realize that it's a muscular area.
Yeah, and I think is it what about like 23 muscles in the pelvic floor or something?
It might be. I'm not even sure.
Okay, yeah, because I heard the number before, but I forgot. Well, that's great. So just to kind of summarize, so the base of the core, as Rachel said, is the pelvic floor. And yes, the top is that diaphragm. So that relationship is important. So now we're looking at the core structure, not just from aesthetics perspective, and that's what's usually kind of driven more in the fitness world. So when we see those 6-pack abs or the shredded core or whatever else, it does not mean that their pelvic floor is in a good state. Because the way I understand, the job of the core is to disperse pressure in the most optimal way between all those 4 structures. Just because we have that shredded core or 6-pack ab, that's the myth, right? We have to think or ask, well, you still might experience some pelvic floor issues like maybe incontinence or maybe hernia. Like I know, especially when I train guys, a lot of them have experienced some kind of form of hernia, and usually by lifting something heavy. So maybe I'm just saying like too many things here, but let me try to summarize my question. Let's just maybe talk about core in the sense of how it's designed to manage pressure and how by us pursuing that myth of having shredded core does not really mean that you're still going to be healthy and well. Sure. That difference between aesthetics and function.
Sure. So oftentimes what looks good aesthetically, like you had mentioned, may not mean that someone's distributing pressure well. So I like to think of it in tendencies. People have a tendency to put pressure somewhere. And it's interesting to watch people move. Maybe they hold their breath a bit and tend to put pressure into their abdominal wall. So maybe that person is prone to an abdominal hernia. Maybe what I see oftentimes is people that have very defined abdominals, especially their internal obliques. What I find a lot of times is that the pressure coming from those muscles is creating, we think, downward pressure on the pelvic floor. So the look is good, but it's like squeezing a balloon, right? That's that pressure system. The pressure has to go somewhere. Yes. So maybe if our tendency is to always use just that area because the brain thinks it's doing a very good job, and that's not your fault, right? That's the habit. Then maybe it's like pushing the top of a balloon and the pressure is going down to the pelvic floor because you're not distributing pressure evenly or in a desirable way.
Yeah, and just like for the pressure needs to go somewhere, and a lot of time the weakest link for women especially becomes that pelvic floor. So
Mm-hmm.
I always I heard the example of the toothpaste, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just how do you squeeze the toothpaste? Can you make that nice and flow and fluid? Or it's all squeezed everywhere. That's why the pressure is everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And which one of those points is going to win? Well, it might be pelvic floor, which could go into that leaking situation or maybe some form of prolapse or whatever else. And this is just not to scare anyone. I don't like to use that language, but just to give a little bit more education. And next time you might be doing your core workout or core strengthening, just kind of pay attention to maybe your breath. Are you holding your breath?
Mm-hmm.
Then where do you hold your breath? And where do you feel the pressure? So that's very important to just even be aware. Like, where do
Right.
you
Or
feel?
I'll give an example.
Hello,
I'm gonna
darkness. Sorry, I have to say hello.
Thanks for joining us. I'll give an example of that. Oftentimes we see people when they're running, especially people identify as female, holding their core tight because either it feels uncomfortable, they feel like their abdominals are like moving around too much, or they're trying to suck in. And what's very cool for us, like I said, we're not trying to scare people, but what's pretty cool is oftentimes if you have someone relax their abdominals when they're running, they will stop having incontinence, which is
Exactly.
so cool that, again, sometimes we think it's this big problem we can't solve that we're having leaking.
Yes.
But in that pressure system, if you're kind of sucking in, and then you can ask someone to change that, maybe their pelvic floor is not 100% cured, but it can help. I had someone recently that was wearing an abdominal binder with running.
Oh, yeah.
And she had incontinence. And as soon as she removed it and we worked on her breathing mechanics a bit and her positioning with running, and she's still shocked that she's not leaking at all because it was totally discouraging her from running.
Exactly. And that's what sometimes I do have conversations with women who are familiar with the concept of giggling, however they are doing it. But then when I ask them, well, what do you do for relaxation? Then usually I get that look, what? I'm supposed to squeeze it. That's it. Which is, of course, we're probably all guilty of that. But I always explain, if you have your bicep and you're doing this, then maybe 10 years later, I'm going to ask you to hold some kind of heavy purse that is no more to squeeze. So like just the muscles and pelvic floor muscles, which I think is empowering because I think like when we have a shoulder hurt or hip hurt, we go to a professional like physical therapist or somebody to help us rehab. And then we don't realize that pelvic floor muscles, and if you're experiencing some symptoms like incontinence or whatever, it's a good news. Like maybe my muscles are balanced, maybe something else. I just need an expert to evaluate and just simply say, you're holding too much pressure, relax. And which would be, of course, a simple solution. But going in that course, what happens with a lot of women when we get to that point, because yes, we have all that picture moment and we're just constantly pulling that belly in, especially when we're wearing a black dress or whatever, because that's the strategy. Suck it in, like you said, and everything will be just fine for that night event. But what happens, I think we like constantly sucking that belly in. And where I was going with that somewhere. And I forgot. I had a very good thought, but I lost it. So if you want to pick it up and continue.
Sure, I think there's two things. One, all that sucking in disrupts this kind of piston idea that should happen between the core and the pelvic floor, or the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. So when you're always sucking in, we're supposed to have this automaticity of the system. Like you shouldn't have to think about Kegling when you run or exercise. We should be able to, the diaphragm and the pelvic floor should be able to work in synchrony. But if you're always sucking in or gripping and that becomes your tendency, that just becomes the go-to. Yeah. And we have to kind of step it back and retrain. But my other thought where you were going is that I think another myth is that Kegels that's the only thing you can do for the pelvic floor.
Yes. Yes.
And I think as we've become better at pelvic floor therapists over the last, 20, 30 years of realizing that a lot of times, again, like you were saying with your bicep, if the muscles are holding too much tension, they lose the ability to respond or generate enough force. And if you're doing like jumping or landing activity, if the muscles are already, half tense, you won't be able to meet the demand, and leaking occurs then too. So it's not all about Kegels. You
Exactly.
need a full range of motion of the pelvic floor.
Yes, that's a good point. So just like when we do strengthening, there is always two sides of the story. And in order for the muscle to contract, it needs to lengthen. And of course, in strength training world, we do use the eccentric strengthening, which is that in a lengthened position. So that's why when we're inhaling and the pelvic floor muscles have to yield and lengthen, we also need to lengthen with control. And that's what I think sometimes is not available, just because, yes, when you're constantly tightening it, then lengthening with control becomes an issue. So, and if I think we start even just realizing it's a muscle, and then we can treat it as a muscle, then we might have better solution. And now I remembered where I was going with that. So what usually happens with a lot of ladies I work with, when I help them to get to the point of relaxing the belly, just like that, navel toward the spine. I like to use that hands and knees position so that you're kind of trying to relax against gravity and just kind of drop the belly and relax. That's always becomes like almost a cultural and emotional experience. It's like you're holding so much tension there, and then relaxing becomes like, first of all, it's like cultural probably moments, like, no, I'm supposed to be tight. And then when you relax, it feels like, oh, what do I do now? But like you said, when you taught your client to relax, things got better. So we definitely need to learn to relax. And I think that's a probably biggest challenge. And then strengthen that. And also what you were talking about before, like tightening or using that kind of belt you said when running. There are many possibilities for core strategies. And if we go back to that example, what you said, core canister, and if we think about just navel towards the spine, then it becomes a very limited strategy. And just like you were going to your internal obliques or transverse, so we're basically kind of stuck at one point of that whole canister, right? So maybe if you can give us a few tips on how you cue your clients to use perhaps all that integrated approach of the canister, where we're dispersing that pressure pretty much everywhere but a little bit.
Sure.
Right? Am I on the right track here?
Sounds great. I mean, cueing, yeah, sure. So cueing is individual. So, what's really great when you work with someone one-on-one is, as a therapist, or if you're seeing a fitness professional in person, we can play with different cues because everyone's brain is a little different.
Yes.
So one size doesn't fit all. I often find, especially after someone has been pregnant and the core has been elongated, or if someone has a tendency to really overuse their obliques or their diaphragm, that the core cue doesn't often work for them anymore. Like if you say engage your core, or like what they'll hear like in a group class, or even belly to spine, what I often see is a lot of these other tendencies. So oftentimes for my clients, and I think there's been a little bit of there's been a lot of research in this area. Everyone wants to know what's the secret to cueing like transversus abdominis, the deep abdominals. And I tend to actually kind of bypass the core. Like I try to trick the brain. I often am asking actually for a gentle pelvic floor contraction because the pelvic floor and the core the transversus will fire together. So I often have someone kind of close their eyes, don't watch. And I'm curious to see what happens if I say, okay, engage your core, or whatever cue you like.
Yes.
And then like, what if it's so I use gentle Kegel, or I use gentle pubic bone to belly button actually. Even though the transversus runs horizontally, for some reason, any kind of core cue with my clients tends to end up with something that I'm not looking for.
Uh-huh.
So that's for the contraction part. A lot of times I'm cueing gentle pelvic floor contraction or pubic bone to belly button, gentle contraction on their exhale.
Yes. Okay. Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. So whoever is listening, you can try that. So you said from tailbone to pubic bone, is that what you said?
So in general, so I am cueing just like a gentle Kegel from pubic bone to belly button.
Oh, yes. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, I use that too. Yes. So yeah, and I try to go all the way up through the head when they're ready, because there's that whole connection out there. But yeah, definitely, and working one-on-one, that definitely allows us to have the eyes on the person right there. And that also allows us to be creative and keep kind of figuring out what cues might work and what cues may not. So for sure, and especially doing Zoom sessions, you become even an expert in cues because it's much more challenging. So yes, that's great. So I think that if we summarize what myths we kind of have debunked today, so and help me if I miss some. So belly button to spine, it's not the full picture of the core. Okay. So notice where you feel the pressure goes when, especially you're doing some kind of core activities, either at the gym or even in the house. If you are experiencing some leaking, it's not the end of the world. And sometimes just relaxing your pelvic floor, you might get lucky. That'll be easy. So we also want to treat the core as the entire canister. And remember just how Rachel said, it goes all the way from the diaphragm, all the way to the pelvic floor and around it and up there in the spine. So as the whole system. And I think what we also said, the Kegels, so it might not be the only panacea for making you good. And also a lot of times what I see happens with my clients, pretty much everybody's familiar with Kegling. Just like the lady I'm working with right now, she's very active and she used to go to the gym and all of that. And she understands Kegels, blah, blah, blah. However she does them, it's okay. It's the other story. But she still gets up off the chair and, leaking happens. So, and that's what it's all about, the coordination. So like if you do the pelvic floor, it's only like 25% of that whole canister, right? But how can you coordinate it? And then how can you coordinate with the movement? And can you coordinate with your breathing and all of that? So we just kind of have to look at it as a whole picture and not that isolation. Is that good, what we've covered? Anything else to add?
Yeah, I would say that's most of it. I would say that usually the gripping strategy doesn't work, whether it's you're gripping your pelvic floor or you're gripping your core. It's usually not an effective strategy because we don't have that kind of flexibility and flow in the canister.
Exactly. So yes, and we are pretty good at gripping.
Yeah, as a culture. Yeah.
So raise your hand if you are. So we know how to tense up. But just keep in mind that pelvic floor muscles, just like any muscle, wants to lengthen and relax and contract. And if we put those muscles in those positions, then it kind of, should happen reflexively, just like Rachel was saying it. It's not that we have to push the heavy door and say, okay, squeeze, contract, don't hold, breathe, push. So that's the whole coordination part. So just kind of working on that. And know if you are holding your breath or you are squeezing too much or you're tightening it, perhaps that weight is too heavy for you. Or perhaps whatever you're doing, like that running on the 5th mile and you start to leak, maybe it's too much for your system. Just kind of regress, reach out to professional, reach out to the experts so they can evaluate you. They can give you some strategies and techniques so that you can be better off. All right. So anything else you want to add, Rachel?
I think that was excellent. I think that last piece of advice is so good. Like if there's something going on at the pelvic floor, something in the whole system is just not as efficient as we want it to be.
Exactly.
So to kind of find that missing piece whether it's your endurance or your pelvic girdle strength, your leg strength, like with running, just trying to troubleshoot kind of what's the missing piece of the story.
Yeah. And basically, like you said, legs attached to the pelvic floor. So if you cannot stand on one leg and you're running, so maybe that might be a cue. Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, I think we're pretty good on our topic. So if you guys have any questions, whoever is joining us live, please put it in the comments. And Rachel, can you tell us where people can find you, how they can reach out? Do you do telehealth sessions? Okay, Debbie says a question, where can I find exercises, samples, breathing techniques to help with this? Well, I post a lot on my site, and I also have an online course that is called Core for Wellness, where I take people into different breathing techniques and explorations of the whole system, because again, it's a whole system. It's not just like core workouts. We work on shoulders there, because if there is tension in the shoulders and in the rib cage, your breathing is going to be not optimal. We work on hips there and on feet and all of that. So if you're interested, I can send you a link. And if Rachel has any other resources to share, sure, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have any this information, interestingly enough, is really not in the mainstream fitness world that I find. So working with someone like Julia, I think, you have to work with someone who understands this whole core canister idea is really the best option.
Yes, and going back to my question, so where can people find you, reach out to you?
Sure. So I am doing telehealth since COVID, which I love. It's really easy access for people. And so I work with sometimes people that have new babies, and it's easy for them to jump on a call or just to troubleshoot. It's really fun to kind of try to be that person to problem solve with a little bit. So I do telehealth in the state of New York, and I have a practice called Parrotta. That's my last name, Parrotta, Parrotta Physical Therapy. I'm on Facebook and on Instagram at Rachel_Parrotta_DPT.
Awesome. So that means you can only take clients from New York. Is that right?
So, okay. Telehealth, yeah. So, with telehealth, I can do a consult, let's say, for anybody that needs like a little bit of guidance where to go next. But ongoing physical therapy, as it is right now, we are limited to seeing folks in our state if they need continued physical therapy care. And then I see people on Long Island in New York in person.
Okay, awesome. Well, yes, I will definitely include your links in this in my Facebook. So yes, and feel free to share if you know some ladies or guys can benefit from this information. Feel free to share this video. And yes, and you know where you can find me since you're here. I do have Core for Wellness online course. It's a do it yourself. And then I'm also doing a group coaching program that's going to be opening up next month. And that's going to be for women 40 plus, where I'm taking women from kind of like that inactivity to a little bit more active life and strengthening. So it's going to be very progressive, and there's stress management and of course the group work and all that stuff. But anyway, all that information will be posted. So yes, be strong, be able, be well, and take care of your core, and try to just pay attention to your body and notice how it feels. Stop the leaks. Relax, I guess, right? So these are going to be my tips for today. Once again, Dr. Parrotta, right? So I think it sounds like more Italian than I used to.
It is Italian, yeah.
So it is good.
My husband's Italian, yeah.
Italian flair, because I used to learn Italian. It's like one of my favorite languages. Like I would love to speak Italian one day. So maybe I'll just gonna try to say Dr. Parrotta.
Very good.
That's it. Okay, thank you again.
Of course.
And good day. So if you have any other questions, just keep posting them. You can also DM them, and to Rachel as well, and I will share her information. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Oi, ow. Thank